November 14th, 1944. Dense jungle northwest of Ormoc Bay, Leyte Island. Corporal James Merrick pressed his back against the moss-covered trunk of a mahogany tree, chest heaving, uniform soaked through with sweat and humidity. 20 yards ahead, concealed in a network of spider holes and camouflaged fighting positions, Japanese soldiers waited in absolute silence. The jungle had gone quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of his own breathing and the distant rumble of artillery from the coast. Merrick's platoon had been pinned down for 40 minutes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Every attempt to advance had been met with devastating machine gun fire from positions they couldn't see until it was too late. 3 men were already dead, 6 more wounded. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in shafts of golden light that illuminated the gun smoke hanging in the motionless air. Lieutenant Carson had ordered them to fix bayonets. That meant one thing. They were going in with steel because bullets weren't getting the job done. But Merrick reached into his web gear and pulled out something different. A white phosphorus grenade, newly issued just 5 days earlier. The cylinder felt heavier than a standard fragmentation grenade, its weight somehow reassuring in his palm. He had attended exactly one demonstration on how to use it. The weapons sergeant had been enthusiastic but vague about tactics. Now Merrick was about to test whether the demonstration had been more than just show. He pulled the pin, let the spoon fly, counted 2 seconds, then hurled the grenade in a high arc toward the nearest spider hole. The explosion was unlike anything he had heard before, not the sharp crack of a fragmentation grenade, but a dense whooshing roar as white-hot particles ignited and scattered in every direction. Thick white smoke billowed up from the impact point. Then came the screaming. Japanese soldiers erupted from positions Merrick hadn't even known were there, some beating at their uniforms, others running blindly into the jungle. The Marines surged forward, and for the first time in nearly an hour, they weren't taking fire. The transformation was complete. A weapon nobody had heard of 3 weeks earlier had just broken a defensive position that conventional munitions could not touch. The story of white phosphorus grenades in Pacific jungle warfare began not in combat but in the sterile environment of chemical laboratories at Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, during the scorching summer of 1943. While Marines died in caves on Tarawa and soldiers bled through jungles in New Guinea, civilian chemists and military ordnance officers wrestled with a problem that had plagued ground forces since Guadalcanal. American infantry could not effectively neutralize Japanese defenders in close-quarters combat. The Mark II fragmentation grenade, standard issue for every rifleman, worked adequately in open terrain. Shrapnel killed or wounded enemy soldiers within a blast radius of roughly 15 yards. But Japanese defensive tactics in the Pacific had evolved to minimize the effectiveness of conventional explosives. Spider holes were dug deep with overhead cover. Cave fortifications provided natural shielding. Bunkers were constructed with multiple chambers so blast effects would be absorbed by interior walls. Defenders would wait until American soldiers were practically on top of their positions before opening fire at point-blank range. Casualties mounted. After-action reports from Bougainville, New Georgia, and Cape Gloucester described the same pattern. Infantry squads would advance through jungle toward suspected Japanese positions. Defenders would remain silent and invisible until Americans were within grenade range. Then Japanese soldiers would throw their own grenades while simultaneously opening fire with small arms. The Americans would take casualties and fall back. Artillery would be called in. After the barrage, infantry would advance again, only to discover the Japanese had survived in their fortified positions and the entire process would repeat. Battalion commanders were frustrated. Regimental officers were writing urgent requests for new weapons or new tactics. Division intelligence officers compiled statistics showing that the casualty ratio in jungle fighting heavily favored the defenders. For every Japanese soldier killed in close combat, American forces were losing 2 or 3 men. This was unsustainable. The Marine Corps and Army both understood the fundamental problem. Fragmentation grenades relied on metal shrapnel traveling in straight lines from the point of detonation. Any solid barrier, a log, a mound of earth, a rock wall would stop the shrapnel. Japanese positions were specifically designed to provide such barriers. Caves were the worst. A fragmentation grenade thrown into a cave opening might kill soldiers in the entrance chamber, but defenders deeper inside would be completely protected. Flamethrowers were effective but dangerous to operate. The soldier carrying a flamethrower became an instant priority target. Japanese snipers and machine gunners would focus fire on the flamethrower operator, knowing that if they could hit the fuel tanks, the resulting explosion would kill not just the operator but nearby soldiers as well. Flamethrowers also had limited range and required the operator to expose himself completely while firing. Requests for better solutions piled up on desks at the Ordnance Department in Washington. Major General Levin Campbell, Chief of Ordnance, reviewed the reports with his staff throughout the fall of 1943. Campbell had spent his career in artillery and understood the physics of explosives. He recognized that the problem required chemical rather than mechanical innovation. Fragmentation worked through kinetic energy. Shrapnel was simply metal traveling very fast. Barriers stopped fast-moving metal. To reach soldiers behind barriers, the Army needed something that could flow around obstacles, something that could penetrate into enclosed spaces, something that would force defenders out of protected positions. Campbell's staff proposed incendiary weapons. Fire could flow around barriers. Burning materials could penetrate into caves and bunkers. More importantly, the psychological effect of fire was profound. Soldiers could endure shrapnel and high explosives with training and fortitude, but fire was primal. The human instinct to escape burning was almost impossible to override through discipline. Edgewood Arsenal had been experimenting with white phosphorus as an incendiary material since the First World War. White phosphorus ignites spontaneously when exposed to air. Burning at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, it produces dense white smoke and can cause horrific burns to human tissue.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The chemical had been used primarily in smoke grenades and artillery shells for creating smoke screens. But ordnance officers at Edgewood recognized that white phosphorus had potential as an anti-personnel weapon. The challenge was designing a grenade that would effectively disperse phosphorus particles across a wide area while remaining safe enough for infantry soldiers to carry and throw. White phosphorus is chemically unstable. It must be stored under water or in sealed containers to prevent spontaneous ignition. A grenade needed to keep the phosphorus stable until detonation, then disperse it efficiently to maximize coverage. Engineers at Edgewood began testing various designs in January 1943. Early prototypes were simply modified smoke grenades with increased phosphorus loads. These proved inadequate. The bursting charge was too weak to properly disperse the phosphorus. Most of the chemical would land in clumps that burned intensely but covered minimal area. Wounded soldiers reported that clumped phosphorus could be scraped off or smothered before causing serious injury. The weapon needed better dispersion. Lead engineer Dr. Raymond Mitchell assembled a team of chemists and mechanical designers to solve the dispersion problem. Mitchell had worked on chemical weapons since 1918 and understood both the chemistry of phosphorus and the practical requirements of infantry weapons. His team spent 3 months testing different bursting charges, container materials, and phosphorus formulations. The breakthrough came in April 1943, when Mitchell's team developed a bursting charge that created a more uniform pressure distribution inside the grenade body. Instead of simply blowing the grenade apart, the new charge created a shock wave that atomized the phosphorus into thousands of tiny particles before scattering them outward. The result was a grenade that could cover an area roughly 30 feet in diameter with burning phosphorus particles. Any soldier within that radius would be struck by multiple burning fragments. The particles would stick to clothing, skin, and equipment, continuing to burn until completely consumed or deliberately extinguished. Extinguishing was nearly impossible in combat conditions. Water would not stop white phosphorus from burning. Smothering with dirt or cloth could work but required the victim to remain calm enough to methodically cover each burning particle. In the chaos of combat, soldiers struck by white phosphorus typically panicked, and their attempts to brush away the burning material only spread it further across their bodies. Mitchell's team conducted live fire tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground in May 1943. Human silhouette targets were placed inside mock bunkers and cave entrances. Grenades were thrown from various distances and angles. The results exceeded expectations. White phosphorus particles bounced off walls, rolled around corners, and settled into depressions where they continued burning. Targets that would have been completely protected from fragmentation grenades were thoroughly covered with burning phosphorus. The Ordnance Department reviewed Mitchell's test results and approved the design for production in June 1943. The new weapon was designated the MEV-15 White Phosphorus Hand Grenade. Contracts were issued to 3 manufacturers. Production targets were set at 50,000 grenades per month, with initial deliveries scheduled for September 1943. Manufacturing white phosphorus grenades proved more complex than producing standard fragmentation grenades. The phosphorus had to be processed under carefully controlled conditions to prevent accidental ignition. Workers handled the material in specialized facilities with fire suppression systems. Each grenade body had to be filled with precise amounts of phosphorus suspended in water, then sealed to prevent leakage. The bursting charge had to be installed and the fuse mechanism attached, all while ensuring no air could reach the phosphorus. Quality control was rigorous. Every grenade was inspected multiple times during production. Leaking grenades were rejected and disassembled. The rejected phosphorus was recovered and reprocessed. Even with careful procedures, production accidents occurred. A fire at the Joliet Arsenal in Illinois in October 1943 killed 2 workers and injured 7 more when a grenade ignited during final assembly. Production was halted for 3 weeks while safety procedures were reviewed and improved. Despite manufacturing challenges, grenades began reaching ports of embarkation in November 1943. The first shipments were sent to the Southwest Pacific area, where General Douglas MacArthur's forces were fighting through New Guinea. Initial quantities were limited. Only enough grenades were available to issue 2 per infantry squad. Soldiers received minimal training. Most were told simply that the grenade produced fire and smoke and should be thrown like a standard fragmentation grenade. Few understood the specific tactical applications. The first recorded combat use occurred on December 8, 1943, during operations near Finschhafen, New Guinea. A platoon from the 32nd Infantry Division was pinned down by Japanese machine gun fire from a bunker complex. After conventional grenades failed to neutralize the position, Private First Class Thomas Delacroix threw an M15 grenade through the firing slit of the nearest bunker. The white phosphorus ignited inside the enclosed space. Japanese soldiers burst from rear exits, their uniforms smoking. American riflemen cut them down as they fled. The bunker was captured intact. Delacroix's after-action report was enthusiastic but vague. He described the grenade as extremely effective but could not articulate exactly why it had worked when standard grenades had not. His platoon leader, Lieutenant James Howell, was more analytical. Howell recognized that the phosphorus had achieved what fragmentation could not. It had penetrated into the bunker's interior chambers and forced the defenders to abandon a position that was otherwise nearly impregnable. Howell filed a detailed report recommending wider distribution of white phosphorus grenades and specific training on their use against fortified positions. His report made its way through channels but arrived in Washington in late December 1943, where it was filed along with hundreds of other after-action reports from various theaters. No immediate action was taken. Throughout January and February 1944, white phosphorus grenades trickled into the Pacific in small quantities. Most ended up in supply dumps, unissued. Quartermaster officers were unsure how to distribute them. Were they specialized weapons for engineers and assault troops, or general issue items for every rifleman? Without clear guidance from higher headquarters, many units left the grenades in storage. The few soldiers who did receive white phosphorus grenades often misused them. Some threw them like smoke grenades, expecting concealment rather than anti-personnel effects. Others threw them at distant targets where the dispersed phosphorus particles were too spread out to be effective. A few soldiers were injured when grenades detonated prematurely due to rough handling. By March 1944, white phosphorus grenades had developed a mixed reputation. Some soldiers swore by them. Others considered them dangerous and unreliable. The weapon lacked any doctrinal framework for employment. No training manual existed. No tactical guidelines had been issued. The grenades were simply available, and soldiers used them as they saw fit, with predictably inconsistent results. The situation changed in April 1944 when Major Harold Blackwood was assigned to the training branch at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Blackwood had commanded an infantry company on Guadalcanal and had seen firsthand the difficulties of assaulting Japanese fortified positions. He had also read every after-action report from the Pacific Theater that mentioned white phosphorus grenades. Blackwood recognized that the weapon had enormous potential but was being wasted due to poor training and lack of tactical doctrine. He requested permission to develop a training program specifically for white phosphorus grenades. His request was approved, and Blackwood spent the next 2 months creating a comprehensive course. Blackwood's training program started with chemistry. Soldiers needed to understand what white phosphorus was and how it behaved. He explained that the burning particles would stick to anything they touched and could not be extinguished with water. He demonstrated that the dense smoke produced by phosphorus could provide concealment in addition to the incendiary effect. He showed soldiers that white phosphorus grenades were most effective in enclosed spaces where the burning particles would accumulate and the smoke would become suffocating. The most important part of Blackwood's training was tactical employment. He taught soldiers to identify targets where white phosphorus would be more effective than fragmentation. Bunkers with small openings were ideal targets. The grenade could be thrown through the opening, and the phosphorus would disperse inside. Cave entrances were perfect. The phosphorus would flow into the cave, following the contours of the rock, reaching defenders who were protected from conventional weapons. Spider holes and fighting positions could be neutralized by landing a grenade directly on top, allowing the phosphorus to rain down into the hole. Blackwood also emphasized safety. White phosphorus was dangerous to friendly forces as well as the enemy. Soldiers had to be careful about wind direction. Throwing a grenade upwind could result in phosphorus particles blowing back onto friendly positions. Grenades thrown too close could injure the thrower or nearby soldiers. Blackwood drilled his students on proper throwing techniques and judgment of distances. In June 1944, the first class of soldiers completed Blackwood's training program and deployed to the Pacific. Among them was Corporal James Merrick, assigned to the 1st Marine Division preparing for operations in the Palau Islands. Merrick had been skeptical about white phosphorus grenades before the training. He considered them gimmicks, unnecessary complications to an already dangerous job. But Blackwood's methodical instruction had changed his mind. Merrick now understood that he was carrying a weapon that could solve problems conventional munitions could not address. The 1st Marine Division landed on Palau on September 15, 1944. The island was a nightmare of coral ridges, caves, and fortified positions. Japanese defenders had prepared for months, creating an interconnected network of bunkers and tunnels that allowed them to move unseen and concentrate fire on any point the Americans attacked. Casualties were horrific from the first hours. Companies that landed with full strength were reduced to platoon-sized elements within days. Merrick's company was tasked with clearing a series of cave complexes on the second day of the battle. Standard procedure was to call in flamethrowers and demolition teams, but casualties among specialists had been so high that none were available. The company commander, Captain Robert Dyson, ordered his rifle platoons to assault the caves with whatever weapons they had. Merrick's squad approached a cave entrance that was spitting machine gun fire every time anyone moved within 50 yards. The squad leader, Sergeant Michael Torres, had been killed that morning. Merrick was the most experienced man left. He made the decision to use a white phosphorus grenade. He maneuvered to within throwing range, using coral outcroppings for cover. Japanese machine gun fire chipped fragments from the coral inches above his head. He pulled the pin on the grenade, counted exactly 2 seconds as Blackwood had taught, then threw it in a flat trajectory directly into the cave mouth. The grenade bounced once on the cave floor before detonating. White phosphorus erupted outward, but most of the particles ricocheted off the interior walls and ceiling, penetrating deeper into the cave system. Within seconds, thick white smoke poured from the entrance. The machine gun fell silent. Then Japanese soldiers stumbled out, coughing, uniforms smoldering. Marines shot them down before they could raise their weapons. When the smoke cleared enough to enter, Merrick and 3 other Marines went in with rifles and flashlights. They found 2 more Japanese soldiers dead from phosphorus burns near a machine gun position 20 feet inside the cave. A 3rd soldier was alive but severely burned, beyond help. The cave system extended another 40 feet into the coral ridge, but it was empty. The defenders had either fled through a rear exit or died from the smoke and burning phosphorus. Captain Dyson witnessed the assault and immediately ordered his other platoons to use their white phosphorus grenades against remaining cave positions. By nightfall, the company had cleared 6 cave complexes using tactics similar to what Merrick had demonstrated. Dyson filed a detailed after-action report praising the effectiveness of white phosphorus grenades and recommending they be issued in far greater quantities. His report reached division headquarters within 2 days and was forwarded to Fleet Marine Force Pacific headquarters by the end of the week. Similar reports were arriving from units across the Pacific. On Leyte in the Philippines, Army infantry companies were using white phosphorus grenades to clear Japanese defenders from buildings and fortified positions. In Burma, British and Chinese forces reported success using American-supplied white phosphorus grenades against Japanese bunkers. Each report added to a growing body of evidence that the weapon was proving decisive in close combat. In Washington, the Ordnance Department responded to the demand by increasing production targets. By October 1944, monthly production had reached 200,000 grenades. Distribution priorities were revised to ensure that every infantry squad in the Pacific received at least 4 white phosphorus grenades. Training materials were updated to incorporate lessons learned from combat. The Marine Corps published a tactical bulletin in November 1944 specifically addressing white phosphorus grenade employment. The bulletin codified the techniques that soldiers like Merrick had developed through trial and error. It emphasized that white phosphorus grenades were not replacements for fragmentation grenades, but specialized tools for specific situations. The bulletin listed ideal targets, including caves, bunkers, buildings, and heavily vegetated areas where defenders might be concealed. It provided detailed instructions on throwing techniques, safety considerations, and what to do if friendly forces were accidentally exposed to phosphorus. Japanese forces gradually became aware that Americans were deploying a new weapon. Intelligence officers interrogated prisoners and examined unexploded grenades recovered from battlefields. Reports circulated through Japanese commands describing the white phosphorus grenades and their effects. Japanese tactical instructions were updated to warn soldiers about the weapon, but no effective countermeasure was developed. The fundamental problem was that Japanese defensive doctrine relied on fortified positions and concealment. White phosphorus grenades were specifically designed to defeat those tactics. Japanese commanders could not abandon defensive positions without conceding the battlefield to American firepower and mobility. They were forced to continue using tactics that white phosphorus grenades were optimized to counter. Some Japanese units attempted to improve ventilation in their bunkers and caves, creating multiple openings to allow smoke to escape. This helped somewhat with the smoke effects but made positions easier for Americans to locate and assault. Other units tried to seal themselves into positions so completely that grenades could not be thrown inside, but this made it impossible for the defenders to fire effectively or to evacuate if positions became untenable. The most significant engagement involving white phosphorus grenades occurred during the Battle for Manila in February 1945. Japanese forces had fortified the city extensively, converting stone buildings into strongpoints and creating interconnected defensive positions throughout the urban terrain. American forces, primarily the 37th Infantry Division and 1st Cavalry Division, faced the prospect of fighting house to house through a city where every building might contain defenders. White phosphorus grenades proved ideal for urban combat. Buildings that would have required extensive preliminary bombardment could be cleared by throwing grenades through windows or doors. The phosphorus would spread through interior rooms, forcing defenders to flee or die. The thick smoke provided concealment for assault teams moving between buildings. Multiple after-action reports from Manila described squads clearing entire city blocks using white phosphorus grenades as their primary weapon. One particular incident demonstrated both the effectiveness and the horror of white phosphorus in urban combat. On February 9, 1945, a company from the 129th Infantry Regiment was tasked with clearing a 4-story apartment building that Japanese soldiers had converted into a fortress. Conventional assault would have been suicidal. The Japanese had firing positions covering every approach. The building commander, Major Richard Hartley, decided to use white phosphorus grenades systematically. His plan was to throw grenades into the ground floor, then work upward floor by floor. Engineers would use satchel charges to blow holes in floors and ceilings, allowing the phosphorus smoke to rise through the building. Infantry squads would follow the smoke, clearing rooms as the defenders were forced out. The assault began at dawn. Soldiers threw 6 white phosphorus grenades through ground floor windows simultaneously. The grenades detonated within seconds of each other. White smoke poured from every opening. Japanese soldiers on the upper floors began firing wildly, unable to see targets but shooting at the sound of American voices. Engineers moved forward under covering fire and placed satchel charges against the building's exterior wall. The explosions blew gaps large enough for men to enter. More white phosphorus grenades were thrown into the ground floor interior. The smoke became so dense that it was spilling out of third-floor windows. Screaming could be heard from inside the building. Japanese soldiers began jumping from upper-floor windows, some with their uniforms on fire. American machine gunners cut them down as they fell. Other defenders tried to flee through rear exits but were met by infantry squads positioned specifically to catch escapees. The entire building was cleared in less than 30 minutes. American casualties were 2 wounded. Japanese casualties were estimated at 60 killed. When engineers entered to assess the building after the battle, they found that many Japanese soldiers had died not from burns but from smoke inhalation. The white phosphorus had consumed so much oxygen in the enclosed spaces that defenders in interior rooms had simply suffocated. Major Hartley's after-action report was graphic in its descriptions but enthusiastic in its conclusions. White phosphorus grenades had allowed his company to clear a fortified building without suffering the catastrophic casualties that urban combat typically produced. His report recommended that white phosphorus grenades be issued in even greater quantities and that tactical training emphasize their use in urban environments. By March 1945, white phosphorus grenades had become standard equipment throughout the Pacific. Soldiers no longer questioned their effectiveness or utility. The grenades were as familiar as rifles and canteens. Training had become formalized, with every replacement soldier receiving instruction on proper employment before deploying forward. Manufacturing had scaled to meet demand, with monthly production exceeding 300,000 grenades. The impact on Japanese defensive effectiveness was measurable. American intelligence estimated that casualty ratios in close combat had shifted from roughly 1-to-1 in early 1944 to nearly 3-to-1 in favor of American forces by early 1945. White phosphorus grenades were not the sole cause of this shift. American forces had also improved in training, tactics, and combined arms coordination, but the grenades contributed significantly. Japanese soldiers who survived the war and were later interviewed consistently mentioned American incendiary weapons, including white phosphorus grenades, as among the most feared and effective weapons they faced. The psychological impact of white phosphorus was profound and lasting. Some Japanese defensive positions surrendered rather than face assault by troops carrying the grenades. This was nearly unprecedented in Pacific combat, where Japanese forces typically fought to the death rather than surrendering. The willingness of some units to surrender when faced with white phosphorus demonstrated just how terrifying the weapon was. American forces preparing for the invasion of Japan in the summer of 1945 requested massive quantities of white phosphorus grenades. Planning documents estimated that the invasion would require millions of grenades. Production schedules were drawn up to manufacture 4 million grenades per month by September 1945. Industrial capacity was being redirected from other munitions to meet the anticipated demand. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan's subsequent surrender in August 1945 meant that the planned buildup of white phosphorus grenades never occurred. Production was immediately scaled back. Millions of grenades already manufactured were placed in storage. After the war ended, most were eventually destroyed as the military drew down its massive wartime stockpiles. The legacy of white phosphorus grenades in World War II is complex. The weapon was undeniably effective at solving tactical problems that conventional munitions could not address. It saved American lives by allowing infantry to neutralize fortified positions without exposing themselves to withering defensive fire. Casualty rates decreased measurably after white phosphorus grenades became widely available. But the weapon also inflicted horrific suffering. Burns from white phosphorus were among the most painful injuries of the war. The chemical would burn completely through skin and into underlying tissue. Victims who survived often required months of hospitalization and multiple surgeries. Some carried scars and disabilities for the rest of their lives. The weapon raised ethical questions that military leaders grappled with during and after the war. Was it acceptable to use a weapon that caused such terrible suffering, even if it was tactically effective and saved friendly lives?
International law at the time did not clearly prohibit white phosphorus weapons, but some argued that they violated the spirit of laws intended to prevent unnecessary suffering in warfare. These debates continued for decades after the war and remain unresolved today. White phosphorus weapons are still used by modern militaries, primarily for smoke and illumination, but also occasionally as incendiary weapons in specific tactical situations. Modern white phosphorus grenades are descendants of the M15 grenades developed during World War II. The basic design has changed little. Improvements in materials and manufacturing have made them more reliable and slightly safer to handle, but the fundamental mechanism remains the same. White phosphorus suspended in water, released by a bursting charge, igniting on contact with air. The story of white phosphorus grenades illustrates how military innovation often occurs not through revolutionary breakthroughs, but through the application of existing technology to solve specific tactical problems. White phosphorus was not a new discovery in World War II. It had been used in various forms since the 19th century. What changed was the recognition that it could be weaponized in a handheld grenade format to address the particular challenges of Pacific jungle and urban warfare. The development process was relatively quick by military standards. From initial concept to widespread deployment took less than 2 years. This speed was possible because the underlying chemistry was well understood and the manufacturing infrastructure already existed. The challenge was not inventing something entirely new, but adapting existing capabilities to meet operational requirements. Soldiers like James Merrick, who learned to use white phosphorus grenades effectively in combat, were not innovators in the traditional sense. They did not invent new tactics from scratch. Instead, they applied training and common sense to employ a new tool in ways that solved immediate tactical problems. The accumulated experience of thousands of soldiers using the grenades in combat gradually refined tactical doctrine until best practices emerged and could be codified in training manuals. This bottom-up innovation, where frontline soldiers adapt and improve upon weapons and tactics through trial and error, characterized much of American military effectiveness in World War II. Higher command provided resources and general guidance, but the detailed tactical employment that made weapons truly effective often came from junior officers and enlisted men finding solutions under fire. The white phosphorus grenade program also demonstrated American industrial capacity operating at full scale. Once the need was identified and the design finalized, production ramped up to millions of units within months. This industrial surge was possible only because of the massive manufacturing infrastructure the United States had built during the war. Factories, workers, raw materials, and transportation networks all operated in coordination to deliver weapons to soldiers fighting on the far side of the Pacific Ocean. Japanese forces could not match this industrial capacity. Even if Japanese chemists and engineers had developed an equivalent weapon and they possessed the knowledge to do so, Japanese industry in 1944 and 1945 was under such strain that introducing a new weapon system would have been nearly impossible. Factories were being bombed, raw materials were scarce, transportation networks were breaking down. The ability to innovate tactically requires more than just technical knowledge. It requires an industrial base capable of translating ideas into manufactured products at the scale required for modern warfare. In retrospect, white phosphorus grenades were one piece of a larger puzzle that determined the outcome of the Pacific War. No single weapon won the war. Victory came from the accumulation of advantages in training, tactics, logistics, intelligence, industrial production, and technology. White phosphorus grenades contributed to that accumulation by giving American infantry a tool that helped neutralize one of Japan's few remaining advantages, the ability to defend fortified positions effectively. For soldiers like James Merrick, who carried those grenades through the jungles of Peleliu and the Philippines, the weapon was not an abstraction or a piece of military history. It was a tool that kept them alive when they had to assault positions that seemed impregnable. It was something that worked when other options had failed. It was the difference between taking casualties that were acceptable and casualties that were catastrophic. Merrick survived the war and returned home to Pennsylvania in October 1945. He rarely spoke about his combat experiences, as was common for veterans of his generation, but in a letter written to his brother in 1946, he mentioned the white phosphorus grenades specifically. He wrote that they had been the most important piece of equipment he carried, more important than his rifle or ammunition, because they had allowed his squad to attack Japanese positions without getting slaughtered. That simple assessment, from a soldier who had been there and used the weapon in combat, captures the essence of what made white phosphorus grenades significant. They solved a problem that was getting men killed. They did so in a way that was practical and deployable. They arrived at a time when they were desperately needed. That combination of factors made them one of the quiet successes of American military innovation during World War II, remembered by those who used them but often overlooked in broader histories that focus on more glamorous technologies and famous battles. The transformation spread across every Pacific battleground through spring 1945. White phosphorus grenades became standard issue, carried by every rifleman advancing through jungle and city alike. Japanese commanders found no answer to this chemical fire that flowed into their caves and bunkers like water seeking the lowest ground. Defensive positions that had cost American lives for months fell in minutes once soldiers understood how to deploy the weapon properly. Manufacturing surged to meet insatiable demand from units preparing for the invasion of Japan. Training evolved rapidly as combat experience accumulated. Instructors at bases across the Pacific taught replacement soldiers the precise techniques Merrick and others had developed under fire. Throw grenades into enclosed spaces. Use the dense smoke for concealment during assault. Never throw upwind. Count exactly 2 seconds before release to prevent premature detonation. These lessons, written in blood on islands from Peleliu to Okinawa, became doctrine that saved countless lives as fresh troops applied them in their first engagements. Japanese soldiers learned to fear the distinctive whoosh of white phosphorus ignition more than artillery barrages or aerial bombardment. Artillery could be endured in deep bunkers. Bombs could be survived in caves. But phosphorus found them wherever they hid, burning through the darkness, consuming oxygen, forcing them into the open where American rifles waited. Interrogated prisoners spoke of the terror that seized entire units when white smoke began pouring into their positions, knowing they faced the choice between burning alive or dying in a desperate breakout attempt. American casualties in close combat dropped measurably wherever white phosphorus grenades were employed systematically. Intelligence officers comparing casualty rates before and after widespread grenade distribution documented the shift. Assault companies that once expected 30% casualties clearing a fortified position now completed similar missions, losing less than 10%. Battalion commanders who had watched their units bleed out attacking prepared defenses suddenly found themselves achieving objectives ahead of schedule with forces intact enough to continue offensive operations without pause for reconstitution. The weapon's effectiveness stemmed from its exploitation of human psychology as much as its chemical properties. Soldiers can be trained to stand firm under shellfire, to hold positions despite casualties, to maintain discipline when every instinct screams to flee. But fire bypasses rational thought and military training alike. The sight of white phosphorus burning on flesh, the smell of charred uniforms, the screams of men trying desperately to extinguish flames that water cannot stop, these things shattered the defensive resolve that conventional weapons could not break. Manila's liberation demonstrated white phosphorus grenades at their most devastating. Urban combat that should have consumed months was compressed into weeks as infantry squads methodically cleared buildings by throwing grenades through windows and doors. Japanese defenders faced impossible choices at every position: remain inside and suffocate in phosphorus smoke, or flee into streets where machine guns covered every exit. Most chose to fight from their positions until white smoke filled the rooms, then died trying to escape. A few surrendered rather than face the fire, abandoning Bushido code under pressure that proved unbearable. Engineers studying cleared Japanese positions after battles found evidence of the weapon's penetrating capability. Phosphorus particles had flowed down stairwells, rolled along corridors, bounced around corners into rooms with no direct line of sight to the grenade's detonation point.
Defenders who thought themselves safe in interior chambers died from burns or smoke inhalation. The chemical's fluid behavior made traditional fortification design irrelevant. There was no safe distance from the entrance, no protected corner where soldiers could shelter while grenades detonated outside. Production statistics reflected the weapon's battlefield success. Monthly manufacturing jumped from 50,000 grenades in September 1943 to over 300,000 by March 1945. Plans were being drawn for 4 million grenades monthly to support the invasion of Japan. Factories across the American industrial heartland retooled production lines, hired additional workers, secured supplies of phosphorus and steel. The entire industrial apparatus was preparing to deliver millions of incendiary grenades to soldiers who would storm Japanese beaches in an operation that would dwarf all previous Pacific campaigns combined. Japanese intelligence services tracked American white phosphorus grenade employment and warned their forces about the weapon's characteristics. Technical bulletins circulated describing the grenades and their effects, recommending defensive measures that might reduce casualties. But realistic countermeasures did not exist. Improved ventilation made positions easier to locate. Sealing bunkers completely prevented effective fire. The fundamental problem was that Japanese defensive doctrine relied on fortified positions, and white phosphorus grenades were optimized specifically to defeat such defenses. Changing doctrine would mean abandoning their only tactical advantage. Some Japanese units attempted to counterattack American positions using captured white phosphorus grenades, hoping to turn the weapon against its creators. These efforts met with limited success. Japanese soldiers lacked the training American troops had received on proper employment techniques.
Many grenades were thrown at inappropriate targets or from incorrect distances. Others detonated prematurely due to rough handling. A few successful uses occurred, causing American casualties but not enough to alter the tactical balance that heavily favored forces equipped and trained to use the grenades systematically. Okinawa's brutal campaign from April through June 1945 consumed white phosphorus grenades in unprecedented quantities. The island's limestone caves and coral ridges created ideal terrain for Japanese defenders and perfect targets for phosphorus weapons. Entire companies were equipped with nothing but rifles and white phosphorus grenades, tasked with clearing cave systems that conventional weapons could not touch. Day after day, Marines and soldiers threw grenades into darkness, then advanced through choking smoke to finish off survivors. The island's conquest cost American forces dearly despite the grenades, but casualties would have been catastrophic without them. Veterans returning from Pacific combat consistently praised white phosphorus grenades as the most valuable weapon they carried besides their rifles. Survey teams interviewing soldiers at replacement depots and hospitals collected testimony about grenade effectiveness across different combat situations. The consensus was overwhelming. White phosphorus grenades had transformed infantry tactics, made previously suicidal assaults feasible, and saved American lives at the direct expense of enemy casualties. Recommendations poured in requesting even greater production and distribution to ensure every soldier heading toward Japan would have adequate supplies. The atomic bombings in August 1945 ended the war before the planned massive employment of white phosphorus grenades during the invasion of Japan. Production was immediately curtailed. Millions of grenades already manufactured were placed in storage depots across the Pacific and eventually destroyed as military forces demobilized. The industrial surge that had geared up to produce 4 million grenades monthly evaporated within weeks as contracts were canceled and factories converted back to peacetime production. The weapon that had seemed destined to play a decisive role in the war's final chapter instead became a footnote, its potential impact on the invasion remaining forever theoretical. Post-war analysis by military historians examined white phosphorus grenade effectiveness using casualty statistics, after-action reports, and interviews with veterans from both sides. The conclusions were unanimous. The weapon had provided American infantry with a crucial advantage in close combat situations where Japanese defensive positions nullified conventional firepower. Casualty exchange ratios had shifted measurably in favor of American forces wherever grenades were employed systematically. The weapon's psychological impact on Japanese defenders had been profound, causing some units to surrender rather than face assault by troops carrying the grenades, a nearly unprecedented occurrence in Pacific combat. Ethical debates about white phosphorus weapons began during the war and intensified afterward. Critics argued that the horrific burns caused by the chemical constituted unnecessary suffering that violated the spirit of international humanitarian law. Supporters countered that the weapon reduced overall casualties by allowing positions to be taken quickly, rather than through prolonged bombardment and bloody assaults. These arguments have never been fully resolved. White phosphorus weapons remain legal under international law when used for smoke and illumination, but their use as incendiary anti-personnel weapons exists in a legal and moral gray area. Modern militaries continue employing white phosphorus munitions descended from the grenades developed during World War II. The basic chemistry and mechanics remain unchanged. Improvements in materials and manufacturing have made contemporary versions more reliable and slightly safer to handle, but the fundamental design of white phosphorus suspended in water, released by bursting charge, igniting on contact with air, endures because it works. The weapon solves problems that conventional munitions cannot address, particularly in urban combat and against fortified positions, ensuring its continued relevance despite ongoing controversy about its use.
The story of white phosphorus grenades illustrates how effective military innovation often comes not from revolutionary new discoveries, but from applying existing knowledge to solve specific tactical problems. White phosphorus had been known and used militarily for decades before World War II. What changed was recognizing that it could be weaponized in a hand grenade format to address the particular challenges of fighting Japanese forces in Pacific jungles and urban terrain. Development was rapid because the chemistry was understood and manufacturing infrastructure existed. The challenge was adaptation rather than invention. Soldiers like James Merrick, who learned to employ white phosphorus grenades effectively in combat, were practitioners rather than innovators. They did not develop new tactics from abstract principles but applied common sense and training to use available tools in ways that solved immediate problems. The accumulated experience of thousands of soldiers using grenades under fire gradually refined techniques until best practices emerged organically. This bottom-up innovation, where frontline troops improve weapons employment through trial and error, characterized American tactical effectiveness throughout the war. The white phosphorus grenade program demonstrated American industrial capacity operating at full efficiency. Once requirements were identified and designs finalized, production scaled to millions of units within months. This surge was possible only because of massive manufacturing infrastructure built during wartime mobilization: factories, workers, raw materials, transportation networks, all coordinated to deliver weapons to soldiers fighting across the Pacific. Japanese forces could not match this capacity even though their engineers possessed equivalent technical knowledge. Industrial strength, not scientific genius, determined who could field effective new weapons rapidly. For the men who carried white phosphorus grenades through jungles and cities, debating ethics and analyzing statistics was irrelevant. They cared about one thing: the grenades worked when other weapons failed. They allowed squads to assault positions that would have slaughtered them otherwise. They saved American lives at Japanese expense. In a letter home, Merrick wrote that white phosphorus grenades were more important than his rifle because they let his squad attack without getting massacred. That simple assessment from a combat soldier captures the weapon's significance better than any historical analysis. It solved a problem that was killing men. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.